Welcome everyone back to Pommy and Oz. Hope we're all doing really well. If you're new around here, hit the like button, hit that subscribe. It helps the channel out. And we're here today to talk about the big game, Carlton versus the Dogs, 4:35 at Marvel Stadium on the Saturday. What is an intriguing encounter, particularly after last week's event. Both sides coming off disappointing losses. Western Bulldogs losing 102-54 versus Port Adelaide, and the Blues, after a dominant first quarter, losing 116, playing 104. But the Blues did win 4 out of the last 5 versus 3 out of the last 5 for the Doggies. Their extra loss coming against the Lions. So they have struggled against the top 4 sides. They did put away Fremantle North and Collingwood in what was a really exciting encounter. And this is really a game here where there's been a lot of questions asked about the Blues as what happens in the AFL when you are trying to line up to win one of these things. And this is a game here where I wouldn't say it's a potential banana skin, but obviously the Doggies are a side that are so much better than 11th place, where the Blues are 2nd place. And this is a game here where you've got to be switched on. And like we said last week, there is ways for sides who are worse than you to beat you on the day, regardless of what the ladder says. And this is going to be another one of them games where there is some danger areas for the Blues and how they can negate that. So let's get into it. So the stoppage scores have been really interesting. So last week, we really did see what happens when you condense Carlton and you really try and get them crammed and hemmed in. It's a big little area of teams that work against us. And that is why Carlton are the most scored against stoppage side. But they do score the most points. They have playing against 2nd best side at scoring from stoppage and the 10th easiest side, giving them a 3rd differential versus 7th. Now, what this means here is this is not really a big panic area that people are making out because of the other data. But what this does showcase is that Carlton around stoppage are trying to be a bit more lucid to generate scores out the back. And that's what we've seen. We've seen heavy scores from turnover, particularly out the back of midfield stoppages from the Blues because of their real offensive way of they set up. But this is an area of concern, and you can see this is why Mark Pittonet's come in. The Blues are trying to look to shore that up and have some moments, particularly around stoppage. Mark Pittonet is really, really underrated just about how he stops anyone running through him. And that's not a knock on TDK, but that is hard to keep up for 4 quarters. And that's something that Briggs did really well. Now, Tim English is a man who hasn't been in sensational form himself, but he does like to give that to runners through the ball. So that's going to be really, really interesting just in that little avenue there, because that is where the Bulldogs are really going to focus it. They want to run through that area. They want to go, and I can see why Voss may have thought, is it Hewitt? Is it Pittonet? You probably couldn't play both. If you played both, you're probably a little bit too flat-footed there. The Blues with Pittonet there still have all their mids to rotate. But this is a real key battleground here. This is something that the Dogs are strong at. And it's a little bit different to last week where we talked about heavy forward pressure, which will then put pressure on stoppage. The Blues have got to make sure that they stick to their plan. And their plan here is quite heavily poignant. Last week, we saw that heavy forward pressure shifted Carlton into the back half of the ground. And their ability to score from turnover is the number one, and they're the hardest side to score against from turnover. And that is partly because they play really a high-up defensive line. Last week, because of the pressure, the Blues sunk back, which created way too much space, and it literally folded over. And you saw with the stoppage game, it affected that. Players were reluctant to get up and overlap to give the handballs out, so the Blues were exposed there. This is a real key ground here because you're playing a little bit of a different side in the terms of their 14th from scoring and one of the 7th easiest sides to score against. Carlton with a number 1 differential, and this is the Premiership DNA, they call it, versus the 13th. This is really key for the Blues that they keep that forward half pressure on. And last week, we didn't allow that forward pressure enough, particularly in the mid-forward third. That was really, really poor, which allowed GWS to commit men forward and also commit more men round the ball and almost playing extras at the time. And that is something that the Blues have got to be wary of. That is pure passion and a level-setting thing. And if it's slightly off, that allows other areas the key concerns here. And their ability to score from midfield is really strong, Brisbane. So that's something that the Blues are going to have, the Bulldogs. So that's something that the the Blues are going to have to really get up high and really, really push. Defensive half generation, you're looking at the best side in the league, the Blues versus the 9th. They're around AFL average, so it's what you would expect. Against the 5th hardest side to score, against the 7th easiest, the Blues forward pressure has really, really been a staple, particularly that mid-forward. And that is what went wrong last week. That was really poor, which really made these numbers more warped. Carlton having the best differential from the back half of the ground versus the 13th. And this is something there where the Blues are really going to be looking, particularly with Bulldogs backline. They've got to put pressure on it. They've got to make it as it has been. Make them go quick, make the pressure, show them short options up, make them go long, like GWS did to us. Carlton had a really good lesson last week in what happens when forward pressure, particularly that mid-forward third, final third, is really good. Carlton really struggled with that. This is an area here that it really helps the game plan. Because like we say with the stoppage, we're looking to break even. That is the aim. And you can see 7th differential with the stoppage. It's a real negating thing when people start looking just at for and against. The differential is so important because it gives you the balance of them avenues. So that's something that the Blues have got to look at there, that they will break even. But when their plan is to break even from stoppage, big issue if you don't do well in your turnover and defensive half and your forward half pressure. It all has to be symbiotic. And that is why people used to complain that Carlton was such a stoppage dominant side, because these other numbers weren't good. So you can see that we've got 5 areas here that are very good, with the stoppage being okay. But even in differential, it's still strong. Forward half generation, you're looking at the 3rd best side in the Blues, and this is what we're talking about. This is something that GWS we highlighted were very strong at last week versus 9th with the Doggies. And the Blues, 9th easiest side to score against versus the 7th, having the 4th best differential versus the 13th. And this is an area here where the Bulldogs can do it. They can put the pressure on the forward line. It's been heavily, heavily shifted with their backline injuries. But this is an area here that the Blues have got to look at and go, we have to win that dominance. We have to make sure that we're not letting easy rebound 50s and we're not allowing them to commit extra men ahead of the ground. We've got to make this a battleground so no one gets loose. And the centre bounce, you're looking at Carlton, who were the number 1 scoring side over the last 5 games versus the 2nd. And as you'd expect, the 8th easiest versus the 13th. This is really an area that the Blues are trying to tinker with. And this is really interesting because Voss has got this horrible thing that you could tinker with it really easy and make it number 1. You just go back to Pitternet and Hewitt with TDK and Kennedy on the ball. And that was what we did last year. And it worked really well. You can see that they're trying to look for a bit more like dynamicness in their movement from the back half. So they don't want to do that. So they're trying to tinker with it. And so far, they're trying to get break even. We would like that to get into the top 6 of differential. It's currently 7th. But it's not a massive area of concern. But it is an area of concern if these other faculties don't work. But 7th probably isn't enough to win your games. You need that in the top 6. And that's what history says. So this is going to be a real interesting battle here, because around the centre bounce, you kind of structured up. And that's why the Blues do well. And that's why the Doggies do well. That the personnel, like we always say, is naturally conducive for a 6-6-6. The Blues here have really got to make sure that this overlap and underlap run from Saad is really on point, particularly around stoppages, and that's going to be another key battleground. We now then go to the incidentals, the pressure numbers, and this is so integral to the Blues with their stoppage game and making everything else work. And they are the number 1 pressure-based side, and it just shows that they're still number 1 even after last week. And you're looking at the 14th. So the pressure doesn't quite come from the Doggies, and that's been the criticism from them. It was particularly poignant against Port Adelaide. Against is really interesting because the method to beat the Blues is put pressure on them and speed them up. And last week it worked because they got some real ascendancy around them key battlegrounds. But the Blues are used to it, and this is another day in the office because they have the 6th best differential versus the 14th, the 5th worst. And this is going to be, again, the Dogs have got to commit men. They've got to commit men. And the Blues got the scoreboard pressure really good last week, but the normal pressure massively fluctuated from about 10 minutes. And this is where the Blues have got to be switched on here, making sure they're at the fall of the ball. They're making every side earn it. Carlton, the 3rd best tackled side and the 3rd best tackling side versus the 14th and 14th. And this is a real key area here. The pressure hasn't been good from the Doggies. and there's a lot of ability to get that overlap run. And this is a real good game for the Blues because the warning signs of GWS are there, and that's what the Doggies are going to have to try and replicate. Last week, the data indicated that they had a chance of doing it, but the Blues have got to really focus on this. Meet fire with fire and get ahead. And the second best tackling inside 50 side, the Blues, versus the 8th. This can jump, and this is a key area here. Once it's in that realms of 1 and a bit tackles, you've got to be careful of here because this is a key component for the Blues against. You've got to try and stagnate our movement out of the back line, and the Blues are going to be aware of that. They've got to really meet it at the furnace. They can't afford to do what they did last week, where they sat back and they allowed the teams to come onto them. Marks inside 50 rate, you're looking at the Blues 12th, which I would say, when everyone's saying stoppage against, this is the most disappointing stat with the players we've got, because I think it's kind of embarrassing, really. I'd like to see that a bit higher up, a real bit higher up. Now, it's okay, the Blues do rely on that forward pressure, and they do try and recycle and generate scores, but you are playing the worst marking inside 50 side in the league, and the second easiest side to mark inside 50 against versus the 10th. This is going to be an area here of the Blues trying to get that quick ball in, and that's something that we didn't do last week. And that's why Charlie was really decimated. And Harry from the second half, it was tough for him. He had to rely on them contested marks. This is a key area for the Blues. And we saw this in finals. A lot of people talk about Charlie. Just go back and watch our inside 50s now and our entries for Charlie in them final series. They weren't quick. They were very laconic. And that is a big issue. Carlton are the number 1 converting side inside 50, though, versus the 9th. And the 5th hardest sides to score against the 4th easiest. This is, again, that makeup. The Doggies are used to being behind the 8 ball, where the Blues are used to dictating the play and getting that early scoreboard pressure. Usually it comes in the second, third quarter from the Blues. Last week it came in the first. It's about making sure that pressure is high there. And Carlton are the second best scoring side inside 50 versus the 10th, versus the 11th hardest to score against versus the 5th. And this is it with the ball movement. The ball movement is always going to favour Carlton in this game. I can't emphasise enough. It's when we have that pressure, meeting it and being bold, but also at the other end of making sure it's quick and it's hard, and it's really hard to move the ball. If the Blues let them get any footing in, it becomes a slog. It becomes a slog, particularly at the Marvel, where it's kind of perfect conditions at times. The 4th best rebounding side in the league, the Blues versus the 15th. And this is a big key area because Carlton are the hardest to get it out of inside 50 versus the 9th. And this is why last week it was such a disaster with them pressure numbers being so bad. So bad. And it shows the standard they've had. Voss mentioned the standard dropped. And this is what it means. In the last 5, to have such a horrific game in that metric, to still be in one of the top echelons of this metric, says everything about the Blues, particularly being the hardest to rebound against when you had less than 1 tackle from each of your forwards is a big issue. And that just shows how strong it is. And it needs to get back to that ASAP, Rocky. Intercept marks, the Blues middle of the road, 9 versus 12 versus the 13th. Easiest side to mark against the 8th. This is a big area here that Dogs are susceptible of the shallow entries. And with their forward line this week, it's going to be even more shallow. They have got Sam Darcy, who's going to be their deep target, but they're going to work players off it. Cody Waitman coming back in is going to be interesting because that does indicate as well it's going to be more shallow. The Blues have got to attack that ball. If they don't attack that ball, you'll see what you did against GWS. And the best one-on-one side versus the 14th. And it's a very interesting one this week. The algorithms detecting Carlton were very poor last week, so it's lost a bit of trust. We're going with a 7-point win, which I think it could be more, but I would take that, to be honest. But the Blues have got to go here. So in summary, the key battlegrounds here, the Doggies need that pressure in the mid-forward. They need to make that hard for the Blues, try and hem Blues back, and create as much distance from the back line to the mids as possible. If they can do that, that's going to stretch Carlton and make Carlton kick long, which then negates the pressure that the Blues do. Round stoppage, they want to be aggressive. They want to try and run through the Blues. They want to expose Pitternet as much as possible, and that is going to be interesting. They want to get TDK in the ruck and Pitternet out and be an extra rotation as quickly as possible. That is what they want. They want Tim English going one-on-one with TDK. Pitternet has got to here dominate. He's got to get the hit out. I'm not worried about his work around the ground. I'm more worried here. He's got to give us first use and make it hard. For the Blues to win this game, more of the same. Make that pressure, make them 50s count, a lot of overlap run, a lot of underlap run, and really, really around that stoppage, you've got to get them handball chains and get it out. A lot of real overuse last week of handball, short kick. Be bold, go route one. It's going to be a game of numbers, this, and this is one of them times that we do look at the inside 50 count. Look at their backline. Buku Kamis and Rory Lobb are going to be taking on two of the best key forwards in the game. It's about getting it in there as deep as possible, and then the forwards go to work. Can't wait for this one. Let me know your thoughts. Peace, love, and light. Pom out.
I see her rolling up, Uber black Cadillac, high heel boots and a sexy body full of tats. Baby's bad, oh baby's hella